The many depictions of colored images from European sources show that Africans had multiple pieces of clothing with both stripes and patterns that you could not repeat by hand. These patterns are not just a symbol of artistic development, but they also show that there was a deep science behind these. It is in the 1900s where some of these techniques used by these Africans were used by Renaissance painters. One of them, of course, being indigo, a very popular color that came from the indigo plant, which is seen in the Swahili coast, in Kanem, Bornu, and other places. This cloth here, that is made in a very difficult way, is from Benin. And you can see here the difficulties that exist in terms of how it was made. You cannot paint these with your hands. These were dyed on in some cases. The most typical tie dye method used in Africa is the one stick method, in which you take a stick, you put it in between a fabric, and then you wrap it up. In this corner, you create a specific type of wrap, but this is not the only way to do it. This is just typical in Tanzania. Now, obviously, this method now has been used in the modern world, and so it comes out with techniques that are very different. Now, we will get back to how they used to make dye, because remember, indigo is a color that they had. In the Kingdom of Congo, the word for dyeing, especially this type of dyeing, um, tie dye, is called lombo or lombi. The style and technique may look unique to one area, but it is not. In Niger, this common method used by the entire community is analogized or is shown similarly to an assembly line. Now, this technique was created over 1,000 years ago, but you can see that these holes were bored into the ground so that one person can do what they do and then they move it on to the next person quite quickly. This was a communal thing. So, in other words, it was done by a lot of people. And this is what spread its markets, and it will be described by several people. As you can see here, there are several people working at the same time. Now, here's the thing about it. How do they get the sort of patterns around it? Well, for circles, they would put a pebble in the early days, but then later on, they would put an iron thing. So, like a thing that resembles a ball, or even a rubber ball, or even a cotton ball in the middle, and they would dip it in, and this ball would create a circle on the other side. The Yoruba call this system idire, which means dye through tying. So, in other words, tie dye. The colors, of course, are very familiar to all of these people living in these lands. And this is what makes this thing particularly unique to Africa. This technique has been described by some of the oldest people in history. Ibn Battuta is the first that I can find who describes these. But this technique is not the only one that exists. Another technique that exists is using stamps. And of course, some of these patterns, it's impossible to get them on through dye, although most of these are easy to accomplish simply by putting a stone on the other side so that you can get this circular pattern. When in Niger, Ibn Battuta said this: they have a king named Idris who does not appear before the people and speaks to them only from behind the curtain. From this country come beautiful slave girls and boys and fabrics dyed in saffron. But this evidence for this tie dye is not just the most interesting part. What we will notice is that the color indigo and blue seems to be the favorite color of Africans throughout the continent. And you will see them dressed in it all over the place. And you can see that all of it when paying attention is tie dye. Now, of course, you would think, why then has nobody really noticed? And the answer is people have noticed. And of course, I'm putting several different tribes here. Most of them so far are from West Africa. And you can see that the sort of tie dye method is used with them. But even if we go to the Kingdom of Congo, some of the depictions that we see are clearly depicting versions of tie dye, these sort of impossible patterns to get without utilizing those methods. Their consistency throughout the continent tells us that these methods must have been created at least 2,000 years ago, even though there is no direct cloth that is found from 2,000 years ago. It's just impossible for them to have invented the same techniques over and over again, especially given how difficult it is to invent it the first time. I mean, indigo is one of those things that they first see in Africa being utilized in a large way, and then they move to India, the Arabs and the Portuguese. And when they get to India, that's where they see it being used there as well in a mass way. So mass that some of the techniques from India overtook some of the techniques in Africa, whereas Africans were now importing a lot of cloths from India in a later date. One of my favorite images is this one, which shows people from Angola displaying a piece of cloth that is well done. And you can see that the people who are here are traders. Traders, meaning people who are selling cloth. And this person is presenting a well made piece of cloth that is blue. And you can see it's got traditional symbols on it. Now, these symbols, in my opinion, are not made out of sketching. It doesn't make sense. You can see actually in the image that the images themselves, the sort of lines, are shown to be identical. This would have been done through a stamping method. There's very few stamps that have been found in Africa, although there have been some that have been found. The easiest one to talk about are the Adinkra stamps. Some people say that these stamps are in some ways imitating Javanese stamps in the method of batik. Now, it is possible that these stamps existed prior to the dates of the 1800s, where they think that they first came. But you can see that if you look at these symbols, that they have these very similar patterns. And I think the way that one of the ways that these patterns could have been made is, if you look at them, you'll actually see the technique that I'm talking about when I show it. Now, Boduk T. Edward gives us an indicator that some of the people who used to draw these symbols did it freehand, but they could do it in such a way that from a distance, they looked like they were printed on. Now, this is probably because they were using a very, very unique technique, and I've shown this technique before. Before I read Boduk T. Edwards' part, I actually want to zoom in to this image because there's something very interesting going on. If you look at the image, you can actually see the dots in the middle of the painting, and these are the guides of this thing. And this thing is called Luson or Sona drawings. And the way that they are made, of course, is by putting the dots there. You can see not every place has a dot, but as long as you have enough dots, you can circle around, and eventually you will create this pattern over and over again. In one part, Boduk T. Edward mentions that the person who was creating these symbols was creating them as fast as he could write. And I think that's one thing that he missed about it, which is he actually had a guide guiding him. Now, another way that we know that Africans did this was using stencils, you know, using some leaves, wood, whatever, to guide the person in how they made it. But here, I think they're using this technique. Now, for the most part, the tie dyes that are used in Africa are the most typical ones used. These circles and all of these that have a certain pattern about them. And this is the unique thing about Africa to sort of portray in your head. The unique thing about Africa is that a lot of these, because they're tie dye, they have that look, that sort of etchy look that you have of tie dye, but it's not that curly thing that you get in, modern tie dye where they try to make it look electric or whatever. I'm sure you can see what I mean by this faded look about it. You can see these faded, like it sort of has the same shape, but it's faded. So let's read what he has to say, Boduk T. Edward. So, so this is what he has to say about it. So he says, drawing number 3, a small loom complete is amongst the articles for the British Museum. They use a spindle and not a distaff for spinning, holding it in one hand and twisting the thread, which has a weight at the end, with the finger and thumb of the other. The fineness, variety, brilliance, and size of their cloths would astonish, could would astonish. Could a more costly one be exhibited? In the absence of which, that for the museum will doubtless be admired for the two first qualities, and for having precisely the same appearance on both sides. I shall notice in the chapter on trade that the richest silks are unraveled to weave into them. The white cloth, which are principally manufactured in Inta and Dagwumba, they paint for mourning with a mixture of blood and red dye wood. The patterns are various and not inelegant, and painted with so much regularity with a fowl's feather that they have all the appearance of a coarse print at a distance. I have seen a man paint as fast as I could write. There will be a very fair specimen in the British Museum. The price of the painting, which was 1 aki. They have 2 dye woods, a red and a yellow specimens of which I brought down. They make a green by mixing a latter with their blue dye, in which they excel. It is made from a plant called acacia, or acasi, but acacia. Certainly not the indigo which grows plentifully on the coast. The acacia rises to the height of about 2 feet, and according to the natives, bears a red flower, but the leaf is not small, fleshy, or soft, nor is it pale or silver colored underneath. It is a thin, acuminate leaf about 5 inches long and 3 broad, of a dark green. I regret to add, our best specimens of this plant perished in the disaster of our march, and no drawing was made. He further mentions in another part of West Africa where the akasi or acacia tree is to be found. And then he describes how the Yoruba use it. And he says, they have no idea of making a lock like the people of Hausa or Maroa. They tan or dress leather in Ashanti, but they do this and dye it in a very suspicious manner in Hausa and Dagwumba. See the sandals and cushion in the British Museum. The former varied and apparently stitched, doubting that there could be such stitching. I undid a part and discovered that they perforated the surface and then stuck in the fine sherds of leather. The curious will observe that the patterns of the stool cushion are all produced by paring the surface. In Burkina Faso, the technique of using this sort of indigo dried color or pigment is something called vouo. And this vouo utilizes not only the dye itself, but also microorganisms. And what it creates is a type of color that you can see in this man's dress. And the colors can change dramatically depending on how you do it. Now you can see that this is the same technique that the people use in places like where the Telem live. The Dogon are masters of this technique. But again, this technique is fairly unique, and using this mud style is a very unique thing to that particular part of West Africa. As you saw in Niger, they don't use mud. And if you notice in the Swahili coast as well, they have their own methods of doing things. As I mentioned, there are stamps from the Adinkra, and this method in West Africa is thought to have come from the Javanese. I don't know why they came specifically to this era, but I will show you why I believe there was already stamps in Africa. So, of course, for this, we need the dictionary. Over here, we see a word called imprimo. Now, this does not mean number one, it means to press or impression. This is a word meaning to print. And as you can see here, there is the word kutola and ndudidi. Both of these words you will see come back over and over again in the context of something being printed or a replica. Now, these words themselves don't mean necessarily to print, they mean many things, but they are used in this context to mean print because they print. And you'll see what I mean. Before I carry on, let me not jump two steps ahead. The blue is in Latin, the orange is in Portuguese or sometimes Spanish. It's Portuguese, but Portuguese and Spanish have changed so dramatically that they sometimes the words that are lost in Portuguese from the 1600s are still there in Spanish, and the other way around too. So you can see here Arieto, and arrieto means to ram something into something or strike violently. And you can see here the combination of the words we saw last time are still here. The red, by the way, resembles the native word, and then a second word is in gray. Sometimes in a light blue, they will put further explanation in Portuguese or the other. This is not how it was originally written in the dictionary. This is a clean dictionary made by a historian, but they didn't change the information. So you can see here Ndulanini and Kutulana. Before it was Kutula and Dula, and now it's Kutalana and Ndulanini. And it means to ram, but before it meant to imprint. Just to remind you, imprimo, kutula, ntudidi. In the next word, you can see here decortico. And in decortico, you can see kula, which in the second line, you can see it written in its full form, kutula ibabala, which means to peel off. So you see the same word is being used in different contexts, showing that they're talking about to press, to peel off, to imprint, to stamp down. And you can see here that ibabala, which means the crust of something, which means the crust, the top part, top layer, Kutula Ibabala and Nduri Ibabala. Now, this is a problem with this dictionary is that sometimes they switch spellings of a word. And you can see here in the beginning with Kula, Kutula. They just do that for no reason. But Nduri is Nduriri, the one that we saw last time. And you can tell it's the same word because they put it in the same place as an alternative to the last one. Now, here's another one that gives us another clue about this word, about printing, right? Describo. Describo means describe, but it also means portray or draw. In other words, if we take it all together, and you can see there the words that follow is kutula and doriri, the same two words going together, which meant stamp, which meant press, which meant um, pull or extract in that same way. And now here it is, meaning to portray something in a similar way than another. And it's not just used to portray drawings, it is also used to portray law. And I can explain that as well. For another, in other words, if you're in court, you know, someone will nduriri, descriptor, as you can see there, mukuri or mutuiri. And you can see it here, meaning to describe, testificor, meaning to testify, kutula umbangi. I know how to say this word because I know it in Gituba, which is a future version of the Congolese language. But umbangi is very similar to the Zulu word ubanga, which means an argument. So kutula umbangi means to I don't even know how to put it, to portray evidence or something like that, similar to that. And duriri and kulunganisa mambu. So to lunganisa means to portray something in a similar way. So to repeat something in a similar way. Now, this word does not just merely mean repeat, as you would think, because there is another word for repeat in this language. This word is lufindu or lufinda, which I think is very similar. You can see there, ubi notatani vocum, and here's the word kufinda. I think you say it as kufinda and lufinda, which is interesting because in Zulu there's a word pinda, which means to repeat. Now, I don't want anybody getting lost with this word. I just wanted to show you that the word that I showed you, the two words that I showed you earlier, which we'll get back to, are not just repeat. So that's not just what they mean. And here's a final version of this word. You can see in Portuguese, replicar, replica, or to repeat, kufenda, mfendiri. That's the pronoun version. So some of you might be thinking, okay, but what if that stamp that I'm talking about is merely a stamp for like a king to impress something on something? Well, that is already covered as well in here under the word sigillo, which is a sigil, right? A stamp of the king. Seller con celo, this means a seal that is sealed, used to seal, which is kuzika iakozinzu. So this is the type of stamp that would be used by a king to seal something. And you can see it in another one, sigilia. You can see it in the signifer or signature. You can see it there as well. So that word is covered here. It has nothing to do. The word that we're talking about there, they're talking about um, impressing, stamping, repeating, all of that has nothing to do with a symbol of a signature. So if we go to a final one using the same word that we were using in the beginning, kutula and duriri, you can see here describo, to describe. So again, back to repetition. Now, you may think this word just means simply to describe, but actually, it can mean to portray or to draw, right? To portray something, describe, obviously. So, again, it falls right under the line of what I'm talking about, this stamping an image to make it look the same, to peel it off. All of these words come down to the same thing. But I think because it's describing a process, they're using the same word multiple times to mean things that seem disconnected. But if you look at them, what they're really talking about is imprinting something. And of course, there's one word that's clearly on the nose, imprimo, which they use literally meaning to imprint. It literally means to print, that word. Now, a fact that is probably true is that some Javanese techniques made their way into Africa and were used by the people. But I think to immediately throw this idea that in the before the 1800s there were no stamps in Africa is a little too early, considering that there is some people who clearly had stamps of multiple types. I mean, even if you're talking about just seals as well.